Welcome. It's so incredibly lovely to have an audience to talk about something which can sometimes be perceived as being a little bit dry, but today we have anything but a dry personality to deliver it for us. We have just bonded as a Kiwi and an Australian over a very close call with a snake on my almost bare feet. So I just about stepped on one, and we've oohed and ahed over the reality of that for the last few minutes. All the way from New Zealand today, we have got Angela Clifford. Angela wears a lot of hats, like lots of people in this sector. But I think what's especially interesting about Angela is that she brings her entirely whole self to all of the work that she does. And I think there's incredible potency in that. We don't have a screen behind us today, so we're lucky enough to we're going to have a bit of a story, a bit of a picture painted for us through words. I'm certainly looking forward to what that looks and sounds like. But what Angela is going to talk to us about is the fact that what she does on her own farm as a food forest grower, as a practicing permaculturalist, not just with what she does in the earth, but what she actually does between her ears and how she makes her decisions, is actually relevant to pretty well everything she does when she's using her head to make decisions for business work or when she's making decisions with her heart in the earth. And I think this is something that if no one asks the question, I'm certainly going to ask you the question on the other side of this. But then we're going to talk about supply chains, and we're going to talk about the work that Eat New Zealand does in its allyship to Maori land stewardship and custodianship. We're going to talk about all of the alternative paths to market, like things like co-ops. And we're going to talk about the fact that regenerative mindset or that Indigenous mindset is actually where we probably all need to be leaping from when we're looking at creating a whole new way of supply chains. Whatever I've missed, you're going to fill in. She's going to chat for about 40 minutes and then we're going to come back to you guys for questions and answers. And if you don't have any, I have plenty. So save yourself from my voice. All right, over to you.
Kia ora. Thank you so much, Jade. I'm so glad you're alive right now. What happened in the moment with the snake is that Jade did what any good person should do, which was jump backwards, just as she almost stood on the head of a baby tiger snake. I did what all New Zealanders would do, is I jumped forwards and videoed it. So we're actually quite lucky we're both here, to be fair. I want to start this way. Ko maukateri tu moaka e ru nei tōku nākau. Ko waipara te awa I mahia nei aku maharahara. E mihi anu ki ngā tōku o neihei o waitaha o nohu nei au. Ko Angela Clifford toku ingoa. Nō reira, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa. I would also like to finish that mihi by acknowledging the people, the Indigenous people of this part of the world as well. I just need to put on my glasses because I'm actually older than I like to believe I am. The Murlakuru people, I hope I've said that right, but it's important for me to acknowledge them and their place here too. I just wanted to start by explaining what I just said. So it's something called a mihi, and every New Zealander tells you who they are based on their mountain and their closest river. I'm non-Indigenous. I'm not Indigenous. Well, I'm Indigenous to other parts of the world. I'm not Indigenous to New Zealand. So I don't speak about the mountain as being my mountain, but rather the mountain that puts its arms around me, a cloak of protection. And my farm sits under a mountain called Maukateri, and she's truly beautiful. And my awa, or the awa that gives me life, is the Waipara River. And it's really important to start that way because it talks about the fact that my understanding is for Māori that they don't see themselves differently than their rivers or their mountains. So they are ancestors of them and they are descendants of those rivers and mountains. So they don't see themselves as separate from the natural world at all. I own the food farm which is basically a teaching farm these days. It's a small permaculture property in North Canterbury with my husband Nick Gill, who's sitting in the audience, and I'm just going to spruik because he's going to be speaking tomorrow as well as being my husband, which is by far the hardest job he has. He is a regenerative viticulturalist as well, and looks after regenerative perennial systems. But on our farm, it's a bit of a mixed bag. We have milking cows, sheep, ducks, laying hens and meat birds. We have pigs and bees. We grow over 75 different types of fruit, a similar number of vegetables. And we have a growing interest in perennial vegetables, and partly that's because we can see that we have been on our property for 20 years next year, and we can see that climate change is starting to have a big impact on our seasons and the extremity of any events that come through. And so we're really interested in how we can move away from the annual systems, particularly pasture and annual vegetables, and we think that the future for our small farm will look much more like perennial systems. It will look like food forests and tropic food forests. It will look like perennial vegetables, and we'll move away from those annual systems. They're just too brittle. We experience drought, floods, windstorms, hail, snowstorms, and they just don't make any sense, or as much sense as they did moving forwards. So perennialism and biodiversity is a really important part of what we do and how we do things. That's not my day job. So my day job is that I bring all of that knowledge and all of that way of seeing the world, both in terms of perennialism and permaculture and diversity and polycultures, to lead Eat New Zealand. And Eat New Zealand is Aotearoa's national not-for-profit food collective. It's so interesting when I come to Australia because there are so many different versions of Eat New Zealand here. You have to remember that New Zealand only has 5 million people. So basically it's the population size of Melbourne. But that's both an advantage and a disadvantage. The advantage is that we only have one level of government. Well, we have regional government and state government, but regional government and national government, but we don't have state government, and we also don't have an upper house even. So it's a fairly simple government structure. So what that means is that when we decide we're going to be innovative or come up with initiatives, we can generally stand them up quite fast, and we can test ideas quite quickly. Listening to Jake Walke before, you'd love it, Jake, like we fail at a heap of stuff, throw stuff against the wall, some stuff works, some stuff doesn't. But it's kind of like that at a nation size. We kind of known globally for this sort of number 8 wire mentality, and that we try stuff out, and if it works, we hold on to it, and if it doesn't, we kind of let it go. So that's our advantage. Our disadvantage is our size of our market. We have to innovate in, and also just general lack of funding. So they're two really big challenges for us compared to Australia. But because we're so small, we kind of show up in a lot of the spaces that a lot of other not-for-profits in the food system space in Australia do. So it's wonderful to come over here and understand the depth and richness and knowledge of all of your organisations and how they work for you. Eat New Zealand's mission is that we'll be instrumental in creating a future where all New Zealanders have access to their food in a connected way, and that this will be food, or kai as we call it, which sustains us culturally, socially and nutritionally. It will be produced in a way and collected that supports the balance of our natural world, our land, fresh water and oceans. We have a whole lot of ways of speaking and working towards our mission. They include activations, events. We do research, both at science and government sector. We create campaigns, we lobby, we advocate. We do whatever we can to try and move our food system to a better place. our sort of creation moment was when this wonderful chef called Julio Sterler came from South America because he'd heard that the ingredients in New Zealand were so amazing. And so he showed up and he opened a restaurant right on the harbour where the fishing boats pulled in. And so on the first day he opened his restaurant, he went to take his crate down to get the fish from the fishing boats, only to be told he couldn't have any of that fish. And he was outraged because he'd moved his whole life from South America. So he did what, if you know Julio, what he was always going to do, which is he rang anybody that had any influence or any voice at all in the New Zealand sort of food hospitality, food media space, and called them all together for a big meeting and told them, this is urgent, where the fuck's the fish? And literally, I've spent the last 8 years of my life trying to work out where the fuck the fish is. Beyond fish, and that's still a really important place that we stand, and we can talk about that when we talk about supply chains. We also work on a local grain economy, working with the Foundation for Arable Research, so that's our sector body in New Zealand for the arable industry. And we are currently working on a grain mark. This is such a funny thing. But unfortunately, we import most of our grain from Australia. So I feel this strange tension when I sit here and talk to people about this. But we are fully capable of growing all of our own grains. And so what we do in New Zealand is we export all of our high quality protein to the rest of the world. We can't afford to eat it ourselves. And I'm not even kidding. Like, we now have limits of 2 packets of butter in supermarkets because it's so expensive that it's a loss leader, and so the supermarkets won't supply any more than 2 packets of butter per person. And we are the world's largest dairy exporter as a nation. So there are other countries that consume more, but no other country in the world exports more dairy than we do. So we don't have access to our own food. What we do import is carbohydrates and sugar. So we export our good stuff and we import everything that makes us really unhealthy and unwell. Another activation is something called the Shortest Meal, which we have on World Localisation Day, and that's really about encouraging people. It's the shortest day of the year, the 21st of June. It's about encouraging people to go out and just have one meal from their local food system or from their backyard, and to share and to celebrate that. And I noticed that activation was picked up by a group in Western Australia this year, which was really exciting to see. We have something called the Kaitaki. So they're a collective of over 120 young people, and they are farmers. We have most of New Zealand's young independent fishers as part of the Kaitaki. We have nutritionalists, artists, academics. We have chefs, hospitality people, tourism operators, event organisers. They sit across the food system because that's Eat New Zealand's constituency. And they are just incredible. They're my succession plan, and effectively that we think that they are what comes next for the future of New Zealand food in this space, and they're incredibly exciting people to work with and to work alongside as they reimagine a better way back to our own food. We also create a national food celebration around Matariki. So Matariki is Māori New Year, and that happens sometime between June and July each year when the Pleiades constellation rises above the horizon. So it's a signal for Māori that it's time to start a new year. And there was always great feasting and amazing kai that was associated with that time of year because everybody's larders or pātaka were full, and so everybody knew how much they could pull out and have a feast. So it's been an opportunity for us to amplify and hold space for our Indigenous food stories. So just like Australia, colonisation has meant that those original food stories were papered over or removed on purpose. So this is an opportunity for us to try and amplify and hold space for those stories. Also have a national hui each year, bringing together the most uncomfortable bedfellows in terms of New Zealand food system to try and see if we can solve some problems. Nobody's hit anybody yet, so I'm not sure whether that's a success or a failure. I'm just not trying hard enough, but either way, it's always a super interesting conversation. I did get a cease and desist letter from the National Seafood Council, so maybe that counts, but there's been no violence. We also help regions with their food tourism strategies, and we're starting to work very much more in food security work. And we're the organisation calling for a national food strategy in New Zealand. Super interestingly, I'm sure you've all seen the hikoi. I hope you have the protests that we recently had in New Zealand that had somewhere between 40 and 80,000 people take to the streets. The young woman, who I've just noticed has been named by the BBC as one of the top 100 women of 2024, Te Pāti Māori woman who tore up the bill in Parliament. So that's all in reaction to an incredibly right-wing government we currently have in New Zealand. So my ability to progress and talk about sustainable food systems or regenerative food systems at the moment is really limited. New Zealand is regressing to a place where we are just focused on doubling exports for our primary industry at the moment, and there's really not a lot of big picture thinking or thinking about the challenges there are to that goal. So I'm really struggling to find ways through that, but we have found some traction that sits around food security. So food security as an idea seems to be more apolitical, and so that's a really useful place for us to try and get some traction in this conversation. We also did a piece of work called with the Our Land and Water National Science Challenge that looked at local food systems, and we came up with a model that I thought I might share today because it might be of interest and useful for Australia. And that was we called it a mana-centred local food system. So mana is an incredibly difficult word to translate into English, but effectively it means respect. And a mana-centred local food system is a place where all of the players in the food system are respected. So from farmers and fishers through to eaters. So because I don't have a picture of it that I can show you, I'm going to try and explain what that system looked like, and then we're going to go through the different parts of it. So effectively, in the mana-centred local food system, there are 3 sections. The first section takes all of our food and separates it into different categories, and that's food production. The middle section is called infrastructure of the middle, and then the end section are called food system igniters. Almost weekly, I have someone who comes to Eat New Zealand and goes, right, I've got it. What you need to do is you need to get the farmer closer to the eater. And I go, thanks for that. Yep, I'm quite well aware of that. And then every second week, someone comes to me and goes, don't worry, I've got a platform. I've got an online platform that will help you do this. And I'm like, great. The problem is what none of this showed was the really sticky bit in the middle. Which is the infrastructure of the middle. So how do we get food from our farmers and our fishers to our eaters? So we really wanted to zoom in on that space and understand each of those challenges through the way. So we separated our food into different categories because often when we talk about local food systems, we get stuck in fruit and vegetables, and we talk about really important things like urban farms and community gardens and those kind of things, but we forget that our local food system is a much bigger plate, and it includes really complicated things like grains and meat and dairy. So it really, in terms of categorising our food, it split things into things that take more processing, like those 3 things. Then things that take less processing, like fruit and vegetables, eggs and honey. Still some regulation around them, but not as much as those top ones. And then another really important category for us as New Zealanders is our wild food. And so we're one of the few countries in the world, although I imagine that Australia has a lot to say about this, where we can eat our pest species. Most of our pest species are Australians. Thank you. But we also have some that come from other parts of the world. And then layered on top of that is a really important and strong tradition for Māori and their connection to food from wild places. So some of the terms they use are things like mahikakai or mahingakai, depending on what part of New Zealand you're from. And they really speak to the fact not just of the importance of wild food, but the importance of the health of the system in which you collect the wild food. So again, those things are intimately connected and it's really hard to separate them. So when we talk about mahingakai, we're not talking about the actual food itself, although we're also talking about the system it comes from and the people who collect it. So again, no delineation in that space. So that is a really important part of our food system. And interestingly, that part of our food system is the bit that's initiating and creating wiggle room in the middle that's allowing us some different form of a food system than I'm seeing elsewhere. So hold on to that bit. Then in the infrastructure of the middle, we've got what we call first mile aggregation. And so these are 4 really important parts of the system, and I've heard them alluded to here. And I just wanted to talk to those quickly. So the first one is on-farm milling. So this is the opportunity to really take back the bottleneck in terms of processing in the grain space. So how are farmers actually on-farm milling? And we have some really good examples of that in New Zealand. They're still small scale. And the flip side of that is on the large scale, we actually have an undeclared monopoly in the grain space. So we have the biggest mill in the country actually toll milling or contract milling for their competitors. So which is completely illegal, it's just that no one's called them on it. So we've got these 2 completely different types of grain system in that we've got a processor who is basically the price setter and the power maker, and then we've got a series of small millers who are able to take back that part and therefore be the price setters themselves. We have a complicator in that it is cheaper to ship grain from Australia to the North Island than it is to move grain from the South Island where it's grown to the North Island where it's eaten. Thanks. And part of the reason for that is that unlike Tasmania and mainland Australia, we don't see that piece of water between the 2 islands as an extension of our highway, which I know you do here, well, my understanding is, and it's subsidised. So that is a completely commercial piece of water. So we have this really dysfunctional system in there. We've also dismantled and mothballed so much of our the way we move grain around that we're really working hard to get back to. So that's the grain space. Then we have on-farm pasteurisation. I have to say, I walked into this, what is it with that, what, hillside grocers in Tassie? Bloody hell. Can we just get them to come over to New Zealand? I walked into this hillside grocer and I went, you've got to be kidding me. So I couldn't tell you, I almost had to sit down between the aisles as I turned around, and here is this in-store milk dispenser. Honestly, seriously. And then I had an even bigger moment when I went down to the IGA in Signet, and there's another one. Like, all of those are illegal in New Zealand. It is almost impossible to get to that situation. We do have some dispensing machines, but there is a guy called Happy Cow Milk who's really revolutionising how you get the system from farm into store. Or at least I thought he was revolutionising it until I came here. Maybe he's not. But he's really, if you're in the dairy space, he's really worth looking at, because he originally tried to start solving the problem by getting rid of plastic bottles, and then worked out what all the issues were along the way. He's even built a bike, electric cargo bike that fits the pasteurising unit in the front of the bike to be able to get it the last mile. And then we've got meat. So this is a really interesting point of difference with Australia as I understand it. Just as Australia is really feeling the heat around processing and abattoirs, New Zealand is moving in a different direction. And so we're seeing this acceleration and this blossoming of small-scale processing. There's a couple of reasons for that. One is that there's a legacy piece of thinking that sits with federated farmers around the ability for the need for there to be commercial rural butchers. It's super important. It was a capacity that was taken away a few decades ago, and there are a lot of old school farmers and old school farming politicians that hated that, and they've been working really hard to get back to a point where there is small scale processing in New Zealand. Like you guys, what we're finding is that most of our abattoirs now are globally owned, and that means that just like here, they'll on a spin of a dime decide that they don't want to do toll processing anymore or contract processing. But fortunately, what seems to be happening is this acceleration of smaller scale processing. We're also looking at things like not having to have an independent licensor or meat licensor, so that skill can sit with the farmers themselves. So that really reduces the cost of processing. And we're increasing the amount of micro and mobile abattoirs that we have in New Zealand. So if meat processing is something that you're interested in, have a look at that. But there are a couple of really interesting reasons around why we're seeing this sort of growth. One is that wild food. So because our wild food is so important to us and such an important part of the equation, we're able to get special dispensation to ensure that we can process game, and that's becoming a really important food insecurity solution. So we are managing to feed, and this started during COVID, managing to feed venison and get it through to food banks. And the other part is that MPI, the Ministry of Primary Industries, is really worried about the black market for meat, and that sits around everything from home kill meat to halal meat. There's a whole lot of spaces where they realise that because the big processors are pulling back, if they don't move forwards now, that the black market for meat will just explode. So that's another sort of lever potentially to talk to your policymakers and regulators around whether or not there's wriggle room for that and what it looks like if you don't solve this problem. So it's not just that the small scale processors won't be able to process their meat, but it's that you may see an explosion in black market meat. And if I know anything, I know that makes the food safety people feel very uncomfortable. And then the final one is fish. And of course, where the fuck's the fish is stayed with us for a long time, and New Zealand has something called a quota management system. And so what this has meant is having a quota is a bit like being a landlord. So you get to consolidate all of your ability to fish into the hands of a very small number of very big companies. And then those companies lease quota to the fishers themselves. And so what this has meant is the exit of a huge number of small-scale fishers in New Zealand, and we're left with a tiny number of what we call independent fishers. So this means that they still own their own quota, and they've held on to that even though they've been offered to have it brought up for them probably 1 million times over the last couple of decades. And so how do we get that fish from those independent fishers back out through to eaters, because what happens at the moment, and this is mad, but 97% of the fish caught off the coast of New Zealand, which by the way is an epic fishery because of the fertility of the land and the depth of the ocean around New Zealand, goes into centralised fish markets, and from there it all gets exported. So we have about 3% of our fish that stays in New Zealand. And most of the fish you'll see in the Sydney fish market is actually from New Zealand and not from Australia. And so how do we circumnavigate that and create systems that mean that small-scale fishers have ways to market? And we're working on and have looked at innovations like community fishing hubs. So how do a number of small-scale fishers have a facility in which they can catch, land, weigh, ice, distribute and send out fish? And so there's some really interesting space in there. So feel free to ask me about that if that's a space you're interested as well. How am I going for time? So the final bit of this mana-centred local food system sits around 4 igniters, because all of this is wonderful, but if there's no demand, then it's not going to make nothing's going to change. So we identified 4 things that could make a massive difference to small-scale farmers and fishers and food producers. One is local procurement strategies, and I know that's something that Tasmania has been working on for a while, and I've kind of kept across where they're up to with Leah Galvin. And but how can all of our institutional food, all of the food that sits outside of the supermarket system, how do we make sure that's local? So that's everything from school lunches to hospital food to council food to government food to absolutely everything else should be from our local food systems. The second one is something called food dollars with local incentive programs. So elsewhere around the world, there are places where if you are in a position of food insecurity, you have dollars that you can spend your food on. And that food at the moment is on a card that can only be spent in supermarkets. But what would it look like if you could spend that food in your local food system? And there are other places in the world, like California and parts of the USA, where that dollar amount, say it was $10, is worth $15 if it's spent in the local food system. So that's an incentive to not shop at the supermarket, but rather to shop in your local food system. And then the third one was something called green prescriptions. So New Zealand actually leads globally in green prescriptions that are associated with activity. We were the first country in the world to come up with those. But what would it look like if we extended green prescriptions to be food prescriptions, and if we allowed our medical system to be able to prescribe local food and fresh food? So New Zealand has some of the highest food insecurity rates in the world. In the OECD anyway, we have 27% of our children in families run out of food on a regular basis. That rises to 1 in 3 Māori, and staggeringly 1 in 2 Pacifica children in New Zealand live in families that run out of food on a regular basis. We have some of the highest diet-related illnesses in the world, including the second highest rate of obesity in the world. So green prescriptions could be a really positive way to get the national government to move in the space of local food systems. And then the final one is some type of tax rebate. And it's been interesting because I've heard various versions of this since I've been here, and they all seem to be at state-based levels, so like reductions in land tax and things like that. In New Zealand, we have had in the past something called a loss attributing qualifying company. And so what that means is that you are able to, if you can prove that you're a food business, you are able to, particularly in a small farm setting, you are able to claim back tax based on what you've invested in that business over the past 12 months. So when we bought our small farm, we were able to do that. And that was significant for us back in the day. It was about $15,000 a year that we could put back into our system. Obviously would be worth a lot more these days. So what does that look like if we can protect the land that we're using for food production by creating tax incentives to ensure that land isn't turned into houses, but is instead stays as productive land. And because that's such a big conversation with the government over in New Zealand, just as I understand it is in New Zealand, that's really a place to start pushing as well. And there's some interest. So that's the mana-centred local food system. I'm happy to talk to you more about that if you're interested. I just wanted to finish by talking about the importance of regenerative thinking. And so we talk about regenerative practice on land, but what we often see is that practice stops as soon as the food leaves the farm. So what are some of the thinkings that I've seen and can understand from my experience in New Zealand around what regenerative thinking in supply chains might look like? So business models including co-ops and collaborations. Our single biggest business in New Zealand is Fonterra. It's dwarfs, everything else is dwarfed by Fonterra, but interestingly that's a cooperative, and in fact most of our meat companies, or some of our meat companies, are also cooperatives. So New Zealand has a really strong history in cooperatives, and so we have an imagination and a perspective and a world view around them, and so how do we use those in a smaller scale as well, and what's the value there? I think what we've discovered is things like with the oat milk industry, we had a big plant milk processor that came on, did all of the work around what a successful business might look like from that space, but forgot to factor in paying farmers properly. And so what it meant is that they set up the whole theory of the business and it completely fell over because the farmers just weren't prepared to grow the oats for them. And that was because the farmers weren't part of that value chain and they weren't taken on board at the beginning and found a way to make sure that they were part of that profit. So I think that's been a really big lesson, and that's something to consider too. And then there's things around a Te Ao Māori worldview that are really interesting. So we just, every time we have Feast Matariki, we celebrate different ideas. The one last year was themed Kai Ho Kai. So it's basically the idea that everybody has something they can bring to the table. So basically, how do we take food out of the transactionary economy in this space, and how do we value people based on the fact that they might not have enough money to eat? What skills do they have that they can bring to the table? What lessons do they have? Are they artists? Is there something else that they can trade or be part of a community and get food without having money? Also, we spoke about mahinga kai and that connection between people and place and resource. And there's a really interesting model that sits around the marae in New Zealand. So the marae is the home for iwi or reunaka. It's the home for people where they come back to, and it's the home for Māori depending on which tribe they're from. And marae kitchens are the best kitchens in New Zealand. I cannot tell you, they're incredible, and they have to be that way because when people come home, there's a lot of people and they have to feed a lot of people. So what is the thinking that can be used in terms of that understanding that moves beyond communities, beyond Māori communities? So what would marae kitchens look like in all communities? And there's some really cool protocols around marae kitchens. So it doesn't matter what you do in society, when you go into the marae, you get in the kitchen and wash the dishes. You get in the kitchen and cook. So it's a democratization. So what would that look like in communities where communities can come together, save power, save bulk supplies, save time, and cook together as communities? And could we imagine that seeding those kind of versions of community food hubs throughout New Zealand? And also this idea of a history of trading surplus. So we Māori have always been traders, and so it's not that we're saying that we have to stop exporting our food, but they only ever traded surplus. So they ensured that their people were fed before they decided to trade surplus. So what would that look like in terms of a food system if Australians and New Zealanders had to feed their people first before they were allowed to send food off sea? I know, isn't it? How did we get here? And then another idea is the connection between food and health. So food is medicine, as it is in so many Indigenous societies, and the term that Māori use for that is rongoa, and how can we better connect food and health? And I think just finally that there are a few things that we've learnt, Nick and I, over 20 years and 8 years of leading a national food movement that I just wanted to share with you. The first is a great Charles Massey quote, and it says, "I didn't hear the question, but the answer is diversity." And diversity has been our biggest lesson. So the more diversity we put into our property, the more polycultures we create, the more different things we plant together, the greater the health of the system. The more people you have around the table, the more ways you find to have everybody around the table, the more powerful and healthy and diverse the system is. And just having different people with different worldviews, even if they're not your own, and different cultural backgrounds is an incredibly important part of the way forward. Also, just being flexible and staying curious. I think that's a huge thing based on what's coming at us. Not just technology in terms of, not innovation in terms of technology, but innovation in terms of practice. And finding ways that aren't energy and infrastructure and large capital dependent, new pathways to market, not necessarily new products. And understanding that failing is okay. And if you're going to fail fast, pick yourself up and move on, because it turns out that we might be in an era of uncertainty. And I think that's it. Thanks.
Thank you. I'm always quite intrigued by the fact that we are so busy in the churn that we look down and just keep going. But actually what we really need to do is look up, breathe deeply and see and listen to what others are learning and have available to teach us. I'm going to kick you off with a question. There's a few things in there that I particularly loved. One was, what the heck you're doing with your abattoirs? That missing middle infrastructure around meat management at the moment is at crisis stage here in Australia. So let's talk a little bit about that. Is Felice Jacker in the room? I don't think she is, but wouldn't she be delighted to hear about the idea of green prescriptions? Imagine our doctors or our medical system could actually prescribe local, healthy, green food. It could be a game changer and relatively easy, no? But what I guess I want to know from you most importantly is, how do you imagine, I mean, you're just over the sea. It's a deep sea with a whole lot of fish in it turns out. But you're just there. How do we work more closely with each other so that we can continue to share and learn more effectively?
Yeah, it's blown me away, even this short time that we've been here, about how much learning I've been able to do what's happening here. And I just really encourage you. I know that it's really easy to get sucked into your own rabbit holes and to think that there are no solutions to problems, but what this has taught me is the importance of actually lifting your gaze and finding ways to better communicate and connect with places like New Zealand. I mean, we are the closest neighbours. We generally have each other's backs when we're not giving each other a hard time about our accents. So how can we, we see that at a trade level, we see that at a government level. What does that look like in terms of a regenerative foods level? And probably a moment to spruik the fact that my friend Fran Bailey, who's been involved in Groundswell and Grounded, we're also bringing Underground, the New Zealand version of this, to New Zealand in February. So this is an open invitation for all of you to come over and learn from us and find out what we've got going on.
Careful what you wish for. How much have you got in your food forest? A lot of mouths. Okay, questions? Where do we begin? EK. I'm just going to repeat the question. What is pataka?
Kai is food, and this is a really interesting thing about this word as I understand it. I'm not a Māori language expert. It's a verb as well as a noun. So kai is a doing word. So in Māori, you don't say, let's have some kai. You say, we're going to have a kai. So it's this beautiful idea that kai is more than a thing. It's a way of being. And that is so intimately woven through my understanding of Te Ao Māori. And the second word is pātaka, which is a pantry. But it's not just a pantry as we would know it in a Western sense. It's also seen as an area which is abundant in food. So we have some parts of New Zealand that are referred to the pātaka of something or other. Yeah. Yeah, so the question sat around Pinus radiata as carbon credits, and it's really significantly having an impact on food producing land in New Zealand, and it's such a perverse aspect of carbon credits, right? I mean, personally, I just don't see that they're a solution to climate change at all. And when you do anything in isolation, including just looking at carbon, you have these effects, these thought of effects. And so one of those is the fact that it's really starting to impact land use. And then they say, well, it's marginal land use that can't be used for animal grazing. The problem with marginal land use in New Zealand, it's incredibly steep gradients. And so when we have something like Cyclone Gabriel, those entire systems fall into waterways, block waterways, and create massive floods. So it's a major issue, and yeah, I could go on about that forever, but definitely staying away from monoculture tree crops as a solution to climate change is highly recommended from any New Zealander you talk to. Interestingly, there are farmers using silver pasture and native and mixed tree systems and being able to claim carbon credits, so that seems like a much more hopeful future for us.
Thanks, Angela. I'm interested to understand how the New Zealand government reacts when you talk about preventative health, because here in Tassie, and I'm the same nationally generally here, that we spend so much money on the other end of the spectrum, but the opportunities in preventative health, I know we have these conversations. The Department of Health here, actually, there are people within the teams that are actually really quite driven to look holistically at health, not down a tunnel, but we still find broadly there's no appetite for that. How do you find that kind of thing? Do you have any gems for me about how we can try and...
Well, New Zealand spends 2.4% of its health budget on public health, and we just halved that. We just killed the funding for public health. Our previous government, the big one study they did was that was commissioned by the minister, sat around something called food environments, and that was a broad scale look at the connection between food and health. So I'd really recommend, it was done by a group called PHAG, and it's called Food Environments New Zealand. Go and find that. And then number one recommendation out of that was a national food strategy. So a designed specific vision, plan, compass, strategy, whatever you want to call it, towards a much more intentional food system for New Zealand. There are some really hopeful places in that still exist, including healthy families is something to Google as well. And there's some epic regional activations that sit around food, the connecting food and health, and food sovereignty becomes a super important part at that level as well. So communities get to decide what good food looks like to them. So there's a lot of agency or sovereignty in that space. And there's a term that's being used in New Zealand now for food sovereignty, which is kai motuhaki. So this idea that everybody should have agency to experience food as they want to experience it, not by how many stars on a packet of cereal. Yep. Yeah, I'm talking about Rockefeller and a piece of work that connects insurance companies and I'm super GPs and yeah, I mean this is a whole other subject that we've been talking a lot with Sustainable Table around, is the lack of philanthropic investment in New Zealand in food systems. So we can see it here, but it hasn't made its way over to New Zealand yet. So we're really hopeful in that space. But someone over the last couple of days has mentioned that the fact that insurance companies are starting to become really key, same in climate change mitigation, right? Because they can see the increasing risk. So they, as a sector, are starting to become more preventative, both in terms of what they'll insure in terms of houses and land, but also who they'll insure in terms of healthy living. So, yeah, it's a really interesting point. Yeah.
We've got time for one more question. Anything burning? Yes.
Hopefully I'll be able to articulate this. So you were talking about that kind of space in the middle, like you've got the people who have the app for it and you've got the producers and that kind of messiness and logistics, and certainly that's something that I find. I'm a small agritourism operator. I have, hopefully will be starting my own beef enterprise, and I'd like to support like other local small people, but these are all like 20, 50, 100K from me, and it's just not worth my time to drive around to a million little farm gates and pick up 3 pieces of cheese and a couple of veggies. And have you found any kind of, I guess, good logistics systems or programs that are in place in New Zealand that might,
Yeah.
New Zealand's geography is similar to Tassie, I guess, is very roundabout, even though it's small.
Yeah, and I didn't really go into the other part of the infrastructure of the middle, including you've got the first mile aggregation and then the last mile distribution, and how incredibly complicated that is. I'd look up something called Longwood Loop. So it's a mobile farmers market in Southland in New Zealand, and basically they have pick up and drop off points along the way. So they have an electric van that will pick up ingredients from producers, and then they have a list of people who want to buy it, and they just create one big loop that keeps going around. So that's a Longwood Loop. That is in Southland in New Zealand. Yep.